policy reports that are creating recommendations for agencies, policymakers, and the private sector officials as they develop and test quote unquote new mobility services. The first one looked at contracting and how agencies put together their contracts, and this one is focused on data sharing agreements between the public and private sector. Please note that these papers are available for free download. We're going to go through each one of them at a fairly high level, but we have a lot of detail in the paper available online. And in each one of, or in this paper, we publish the process, the pitfalls, the challenges with setting up the data sharing agreement, and we also have a lot of the specific types of data, levels of aggregation, and a ton of detail that are really kind of show how this data agreement is put together. And the purpose is to show an example. We know that other agencies putting together data sharing agreements will and probably should have those that look quite different than these ones based on their own goals. But we really want to help provide guidance on how to structure and put together and what to expect when putting together a data sharing agreement. We certainly want to thank the staff at LA Metro, King County Metro, Sound Transit, as well as representatives from Lyft and VIA for their review and input of this paper. And also thank you to our research collaborators, Ann Brown, Mark Hallenbeck, Michael Manville, and others for their assistance in the project development. Before we get into the specifics, this report is a spinoff of the Federal Mobility on Demand Sandbox project. This is mobility on demand, at least is how we are defining it and how this program defines it, is a transportation service that can be hailed in real time for an impending trip. FTA awarded $8 million to 11 unique projects, and this specific project that we're reviewing was part of a $1.3 million award to a partnership between the Los Angeles and Puget Sound regions and a mobility on demand provider. The stated goal of that project in these regions is to provide first mile, last mile service from select heavy rail, light rail, and bus rapid transit stations to define how TNC services can be aligned with existing transit service to serve as a first mile, last mile solution, define how key partners can cost effectively ensure equal access for individuals with disabilities and low incomes, and demonstrate payment integration across transit operator and TNC platforms, specifically looking to enable lower income and unbanked populations access. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alice Grossman, who's going to walk through some of the specifics of this case study, as well as some of the larger issues that loom for any agency trying to put together an effective data sharing agreement.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. So we're going to sort of dive into the purpose of the data sharing agreement specifically for this project and go through the data sources that we found and what we were able to share between the transit agencies, the mobility on demand provider, and the project collected data. So in order to figure out sort of what data we needed and how to go about negotiating with each other, what we were going to be able to share with each other, first we really started talking about the purpose of the project. And so when you're able to connect all of the data you're collecting to the measures that go back to the goals of your project, there's really not a lot to negotiate in the end because you're all on the same page to begin with. So the most important thing is to really figure out what that purpose is. And then you've got to look through, how you're able to define the granular data that you need to be able to answer those questions, at what different levels of aggregation you're going to be able to answer the questions you're looking at, and then figure out sort of what are the parameters behind the ownership and the access and the formatting to make sure that everybody's going to be able to play their own part with the data that is being shared between all of the entities involved. So in thinking about how we're going to answer these questions, it's really, what are the research questions, which are often sort of who is using this service? Where are they starting? Where are they going? What is the purpose of people's trips using these services? How are they trying to get there? how much different things cost, and when they need to use the service. So as far as this specific case study, in order to get the data that we needed and figure out sort of where it's coming from, how we're all going to access it and where it's stored, we were looking at 3 types of data. So we were getting data from transit agencies, we were getting data from VIA, and then we were also able to generate our own data as researchers for this. So we started out looking at the transit agency data. This is something that a lot of the research team are used to working on, luckily, and transit agencies generally are very prepared to be able to share their data because they've been doing this for decades. When it comes to looking at the mobility on demand data, these are a lot of new companies. It's a new transportation service in a lot of ways. And so research teams are still figuring out the best ways to handle all of those data. So that's what we're really going to focus on today and in this report, is looking at how VIA was able to share that data with the transit agencies and the research team. The importance of getting a handle on both the transit data and the mobility on demand data to begin with is then you can figure out sort of what gaps do you have, what you need to find, and what additional data might we need to collect to be able to connect all of these different elements of the data elements of the research project. So as an overview, in order to make sure we were able to fill all of those gaps, getting what we needed to from the mobility on demand provider, we settled on a couple of different types of tables. So in order to answer the questions about sort of when, where, how fast, etc., we got trip level data. And so this is a type of data that a lot of transportation planners and engineers are used to working with. So these are the tables we were able to get from VIA. So we were able to connect the transit data and our survey data, looking at different travel behaviors. We have trip level data, we have request data. So that's looking at when you're using these mobility on demand providers, you've got all of the data coming in through the apps, which is something that a lot of us as transportation planners and engineers haven't been using as much, except for maybe in the last 5 to 10 years. So you're really allowed to, you're able to look at a user level that you're not from a lot of other data sources. So looking at how many people are creating accounts, if they're requesting from the app versus from the phone, how often people are, signing on to new accounts, reusing the same service, etc. We also got vehicle data, so that is tracking it by vehicle, and that can help answer a lot of questions about VMT and some environmental impact questions. We're also looking at ridership data, and so that's looking at how people are using the system, most importantly. And then also there were a couple of aggregate tables that we were able to get, looking at pickups and drop-offs and looking at those locations at a trip level, and driver hours as well. And so these tables all were to be able to answer our research questions, but also so that the transit agencies could make sure that they were able to do some project management and assessment in real time and after the fact. So for example, that last point that you see there, the daily driver hours, there are elements of the contract that see how many hours drivers can be on the road, and so we're able to look at things like that too. So there was a lot of purpose behind these data that were shared, and by coming together and talking about that, it was easy to figure out what we needed to a certain extent. So how did we get there? I think that's the most difficult question. It did take quite a bit of time, but once we did it, we came out with a great outcome. So once you figure out what those original questions are, then you really have to figure out, well, how are we going to access those data? How are we going to store those data? What format do we need them to be in? What levels of aggregation do we need to share? If we're really looking at, increase of weekly ridership, we don't need a daily level data for those. So it's thinking about specifically what data we need. And in the end, having too much data doesn't make anybody's life easier. As a researcher, I much prefer to have a streamlined data set that has all of the variables I need than a whole lot of excess data that isn't actually going to get to those research questions. So thinking about that, being able to streamline it down was really useful. And then also this depends on where the data are coming from. So transit agency data versus other external data sets versus mobility on demand data sets, and then the project user survey data all had different parameters that we had to be able to think about, different personally identifiable information, etc. And when you're pulling data from lots of different data sets, it's also thinking about how you're going to be able to join those data sets in the end. So when you're looking at variable names and standardization and things like that, making sure that you know every source that you're going to be pulling the data from and how you're going to combine those data sources is an important element to be thinking about moving into it. From a researcher perspective, a lot of the legal considerations are honestly things that we were considering anyway. But depending on the purpose of your data collection and what you're doing with it, it's really important to make sure that you have all of these legal considerations covered. So looking at things like FOIA and Public Records Act requests, and what's PII and what's trade secret, and how you can protect these things for personal privacy, cybersecurity, and for the security of the companies, the private companies that are sharing their data. So there's a lot of sort of new regulations coming through on these. If you look at Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation that passed last year, which is a model that a lot of people think might be coming through to other places in the world moving forward. And in fact, right here in the US and right here in California, one of the areas where we're working on this Mobility on Demand project, we do see the California Consumer Privacy Act, which we had to make sure we were complying with, to make sure that we are storing and accessing all of these data in a compliant way. So back to our specific case study. After agreeing on the goals for the data sharing agreement, we wanted to make sure that the transit agencies and VIA could both evaluate and adjust the service throughout the year-long pilot. And this really was, like when I was saying about thinking about levels of aggregation, it was, you know, sometimes day to day, but usually week to week, what's happening to the ridership, who's riding, where are they going, what's the demand. And that way the agencies and VIA were able to work together, and they have been sort of adjusting, you know, what hours is this service available, who is it serving where and when. And then also they wanted to be able to see, you know, is this something that we should continue doing? So at the end of the pilot, you know, should they continue providing this service? Is it reaching the project goals? And then related to that, we also wanted to make sure that the research team could answer all of the research questions that we agreed on at the beginning, which is really to assess the accessibility and the equity impacts of this project, which is what LA Metro, Sound Transit, King County Metro, and VIA were all hoping to be able to get to throughout this project. So it did not take a short amount of time to be able to get to where we got to. At the beginning of the project, if you guys caught our last webinar on the contracting process, this timeline might look fairly familiar to you, elements of it. At the very beginning of the project, we were talking to a different mobility on demand provider. There was a lot of discussion about what data needed to be shared, along with lots of different elements of the project that are outside the scope of our data sharing discussion today. But as those discussions went on and eventually led to a dissolution of that partnership, we had to start over to a certain extent and look for a new mobility on demand provider. But we learned from that experience, and by making sure that we were setting out sort of what the goals and needs for this project were from the beginning, we were able to find VIA through a competitive process and make sure that we were working from the same goals to begin with. And then the most important element, I think, on this timeline here, you can see the third to bottom box says that there is a term sheet signed. So the contracting process takes a lot of time. There are a lot of elements to the contracting process, figuring out liability, figuring out labor negotiations. A lot of these elements, while they might be tangentially related to the data sharing, really aren't. And so in order to sort of get those data sharing agreements down and in writing and agreed upon from the beginning was a way for all of the parties involved to realize that we were going to be able to achieve what we wanted to achieve in this research element of the project and get the data that we wanted to and know how to use it, who was going to own it, how we were going to access it. And then we could move along with the contract, but that wasn't still sort of hanging in the air and hanging over people's heads. So that allowed us to really get going and instill trust in all of the partners in the project very early on, and was a very important element of this data sharing agreement process. So overall, I think a lot of the lessons that we learned in this project that are relatable no matter what your project purpose is or what questions you're trying to answer or who you have involved, is really starting at the beginning with the project goals and making sure that all of the data requests and data shared relate back to those. and that the ownership, access, and formatting models are able to support those goals and support the data and quantitative metrics that you want. And figuring those out early and getting them just in writing, maybe not in the final contract, but non-legally binding signed sheets that everybody involved says, yes, I'm okay with this, is a good way to make sure you're on the same page and facilitate productive conversations and research moving forward. We also found it very helpful to make sure that we had transit agency staff, mobility on demand provider staff, and research experts all involved with this. So our research team, for example, includes Dr. Mark Hallenbeck up in Seattle, who is the guru of ORCA data, absolute expert in the field. We had Dr. Ann Brown, who wrote a fabulous dissertation that uses mobility on demand data. She was very familiar with accessing and using those data. And Dr. Mike Manville at UCLA, who is very familiar using the transit data in LA and has worked through that before. And so by bringing together these experts who have all worked with these very specific types of data before, meant that our data needs going into this were very clear, and the expertise we had behind figuring out, how are we going to join these tables? What are we going to need? Was all there, and we were able to work together with the transit agencies and the mobility on demand provider to come from all of these different perspectives and figure out the best way to mesh it all together. And then while you're doing this, obviously you need to think about what the state, local, and agency legal constraints are. And if you're going to be working on a project that is included in various jurisdictions or various agencies, you've got to make sure you've got all of those under control, so that the bigger it is, the more variation in legal constraints you're going to have. And then also just think about all the possible data sources. So we ended up adding our own data collection to this because you can't get everything you want from everybody all the time. And just because somebody has a certain type of data doesn't mean that data is going to be useful. So it's really thinking about what you need and how you're going to get it. There's no reason to have extraneous data, but if there's something you need, then you're looking at how to collect it and how to connect it to the other data sources. So I think now we have a couple minutes for questions. Sorry about the technical difficulties moving forward. Questions can also include, please go back to slide 3 and explain that better. So I'm going to hand it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Alice. As she said, we're now going to move into the next 10 minutes of Q&A. Please use the questions function on the chat icon in your GoToWebinar panel. And I'm going to start with one that we got earlier on in the presentation about trade secrets. How did the agencies deal with trade secrets when they were putting together the data agreement?
Great question. So this was part of the conversation after we decided upon what data we were going to need to answer the questions. Then we were able to talk about, what we can publish, what we can't publish, what's going to be FOIA-able, what's not going to be FOIA-able. And so this was really part discussion between the mobility on demand provider and the agencies and a little bit the researchers, but also just looking at the legal structure. And so the state of California and the state of Washington have very specific laws about what is public records and what is not. So it was really a combination of looking at the legal structures and having a conversation about what was trade secret and what was not. And this also included, one way to think about this too is sometimes it depends on the level of aggregation. So if there's a certain type of data that you're interested in and a private provider says, well, that's really trade secret, keep talking to them and saying, well, what if we look at it aggregated weekly instead of at the trip level? Or what if we look at it aggregated monthly, depending on the number of trips? And sometimes you're able to find a middle ground in terms of figuring out what you want to publish or what you want to be able to share or what's going to be FOIA-able. And so there's always more options, and it's important to examine all of them.
Were there any data that you were hoping to get, we were hoping to get as part of this process, but for whatever reason weren't able to get it, and why was that the case?
That's a good question, and I might ask for your recollections as well, Paul. We are deep into the data analysis process right now, and I would say that my main wish is that we had more survey responses, which is, anytime you put out a survey, that's that's your wish. Uh, but in terms of figuring out between the transit agencies and the mobility on demand providers, we were able to work together and figure out how to share data with each other to answer the questions we want to answer. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I should reiterate a point that Alice made earlier, is that the data sharing agreement that the agencies have with VIA is one component of the broader data analysis. We're also surveying riders and of the system and of the service. We're also looking at transit agency data that they have for on their ORCA or TAP card, and comparing all that together. So this is a component of the broader analysis. Just one quick question here. Is the data in the repository updated in real time?
It's updated on a weekly basis, which, from a research perspective is plenty. And from the transit agency's perspective too, these are really important projects. But rarely do you ever have somebody sitting there staring at data coming in at real time, unless you're working at a TMC, in which case they're looking at real-time data across an entire network. And so no one's really staring at what's happening in real time unless there's an emergency.
Some questions here about some specifics. How detailed are the origin and destination coordinates?
I think it's up to 3 decimals for that long is the. I am not able to definitively answer that question, so I'm not going to. But I can check and we can get back to you.
And how did you manage differences in metadata, particularly in fields that were being used for joining data sets?
I'm sorry, how particular?
How did you manage differences in the data, particularly in fields that were being used to join?
We created fields to be able to make sure we could join. So for example, figuring out how to join ORCA, well, with the ORCA data, when you tap in a VIA vehicle versus you tap on Sound Transit versus you tap on King County Metro, these systems were designed that you have one ORCA ID. And so we're able to use that ID to track traveling through the system. In other cases, we were able to create our own ID numbers in the data sets so that we could join tables as we wanted to. So that's something that you need to think about when you start, because you've got to have those variables that you can use to join from the very beginning.
A question about personally identifiable information. Did this data process collect PII? Who on the research team has access to it, and can it be reverse engineered?
Yes, it does collect PII, and all of the authorized research team does have access to that. And it is securely stored and accessed and not shared or published.
Fair enough. Question here, can you be a little more specific about which types of data you were able to legally protect from public records requests, and which forms of the data you decided were acceptable for public release? So was all disaggregated individual trip data found to be exempt from public disclosure?
I have to admit, I haven't specifically looked at exactly what would be FOIable and what would not. But when we worked together as a research team, we did take that into consideration. And if you had asked me that question 2 years ago, I probably could have answered more specifically. But yeah, we absolutely would not release a specific trip information, and I'm not sure in what instance that would ever be FOIA-able.
A question here, did we use VIA's app to push the survey to riders? Some people look like they're thinking about doing this in their own pilots.
Yeah, we examined lots of different ways to survey users. So we did intercept surveys for transit riders, and then we did work with VIA to survey their riders as well. And I think depending on the mobility on demand service provider and the platform they're using, and specifically how the technology for that specific project works, there's lots of different options on how you can survey different users of the system. So.
Quick question here. We have a clarifying question. What is ORCA? ORCA is the fare card system in the Puget Sound region. So that's the tap card that they use to access the buses and trains. And that was also integrated into the VIA platform in the Puget Sound region. Question here. Where'd it go? What did we do about data quality? And did we establish some kind of rules or governance to ensure that the data being loaded was of sufficient quality?
So we are doing our best to make sure that the data we're collecting is as good quality as possible. You know, there's always going to be data cleaning that happens afterwards, but also you've got to realize that there's always going to be bias in the data you're collecting. So there is fare evasion. There are card readers that don't work. And one of the reasons why it's good to have people on the research teams who have worked with different types of data like transit agency data and mobility on demand data before is that we're familiar with this. We've seen it before. We've seen weird things in data sets before. And so it's something that we keep in mind while doing this research, is that there's always going to be these biases and these abnormalities. And it's also being able to see trends in the research and say, hey, you know, this looks weird to me, and let's try and figure out why. And sometimes it has to do with behavior, and sometimes it has to do with something technical. So it's both. It's realizing that data sets are never perfect and figuring out how to deal with those biases, but then also, you know, once the data come in, there's a lot of data cleaning that's got to happen, and you just have to put the time and expertise into doing that.
And that's a good segue. I mean, we're about at our time limit. We do have a bunch of questions about, so you have all this data, so what is it telling us, right? What are some of the results from the early data analysis? And I don't think we have the time to go into that now, in part because that analysis is currently underway. And we will be sharing a lot of that with you in upcoming webinars in the next few months. The first year of the LA pilot just ended and is now in its extension for the next 6 months. The Puget Sound pilot is coming to a close in April. So we'll be getting a lot of data and a lot of look at how this last year went, and we'll be presenting on that in the next few months. The slides for this webinar are available on our website, and we'll post those along with the recording of this webinar in the next few days. And of course, stay tuned. We're going to be continuing to put out reports on ones that are upcoming, include the fare integration, how these agencies worked with VIA to integrate fares, the ADA accessibility of the service, and what were some of the barriers and solutions to overcoming that challenge, and then of course the full data analysis of the actual pilot will be forthcoming. More specific questions on this report. Of course, we have a lot of tables at the very end of the report that go into a lot of the very specifics of the exact data that we were able to get, its level of aggregation, some of those kind of things, which I think will be really helpful for those. Here's Alice is pulling up a table right now on the webinar screen. You can see a sample of one of those tables found in the appendices of some of the specifics, data type, and the reason why it was requested. Anyone that is in the process of developing one of these data sharing agreements, please feel free to reach out directly to Alice or to me if you have any questions, and hopefully we can help you, or at least direct you to somebody who can be the most help. So with that, thank you all for joining, and we look forward to having you on next time.